All right, let's continue going through the U.S. Poker Open 50K main event. Cajun asked about the previous hand. I would definitely have bet bigger on the flop. If I did bet the flop, I would check the turn, because turn's horrible for Negreanu. All right, here I have a hand. I just typed, what is going on, in my notes. So, Negreanu raises 16K with ace-king on the button. Dan Smith calls, pocket fours in the big blind, which I think is fine. Flop comes 8-5-5. Negreanu bets tiny. One thing you will definitely see again in these high-stakes games are players using small bets. That's because they expect to have a range advantage. When you have a range advantage, you can bet almost every time for a tiny amount. This is a very strong play. Your opponents can't do anything about it. Definitely implement it into your games if you are playing against people who are anywhere near competent. All right. Negreanu bets 11K. Smith now check raises. Okay. This is a board where Dan Smith should definitely have the nut advantage. That is definitely worth mentioning. He also has a hand that cannot necessarily check call flop, check call turn, then check call river. If you play around with the GTO programs, you'll see they do often suggest raising stuff like pocket fours here or an 8 in this spot. And you're doing that mostly for protection. You do get overcards to fold, which is fantastic. You also make it difficult for your opponent to bluff you on the turn, which is also fantastic. So I'm okay with this. And now Negreanu elects to call with the ace-king for 26K more. Into a, gosh, how much is it going to be? Into 120K pot, which I think is fine. Remember how I mentioned earlier, you can't just be folding ace highs on boards like this when you get check raised? Well, here we are. We're showing it to you now. All right, on the turn, Smith bets small again. And Negreanu decides to raise now to 105,000. I don't know what's going on at this point. When Smith bets again, 35K, I think Negreanu should probably call. Because if he raises, he's never making the nut hands fold. And I definitely do think that Smith is going to have way more fives in his range than Negreanu is going to have fives. I do understand that Negreanu has overpairs, but even then you don't want to be ramming and jamming overpairs when your opponent's range should have the fives. So, not exactly sure what to make of this. I think Smith's turn bet may be played better as a check. When you check raise the flop and your opponent calls you, you have essentially protected your equity. Once you've protected your equity, you don't need to continue betting on the turn, I don't think. So I'm fine with this hand up until the turn. And on the turn, I think Smith should probably check. And I think Negreanu should often check behind. Instead, it went bet raise. And I don't know what to make of this. I will have to consult my friends on this one. I would be surprised if you ran this through the GTO machines. I don't think they would tell you to do this. Maybe they would say bet small for Smith. I could still see that being fine. But I don't think it's going to tell Negreanu to raise. I think Negreanu should probably just keep calling. You say calling as a float. Well, be careful defining stuff like this is a float. When you start talking about GTO, you want to break your hands down into premium made hands, marginal made hands, draws, and garbage. And this ace-king right here is a very clear marginal made hand. Marginal made hands want to get to showdown as cheaply as possible. Negreanu has taken his marginal made hand on the turn and instead decided to play it as a draw. And I don't have a problem with that. But I think the hand is still just a marginal made hand. Where's this transcript located? I had someone go through and watch lots of these videos for me and transcribe them. I don't have time to watch all the videos myself, and I like to be able to look at them, go back easily, notate stuff, etc., etc. So I had to pay someone to do this for me. What story is he saying if he checks? Well, we're not telling stories here. We're playing poker. It is perfectly fine to check raise the flop. Again, playing with the GTO programs. They love check raising the flop for protection and then checking the turn because the protection has been achieved. Notice here, when you check raise the flop of fours and your opponent calls you with overcards, you have achieved your protection. You did it. You got them to put in money behind. If you keep betting on the turn, though, are they going to keep putting money in behind? That's the goal, right? We're trying to value bet here. We're not trying to tell a story. We're not trying to say, I have exactly a set or something like that. I think a lot of people get in their minds that they're trying to represent something, but you're representing a range. And your hand that you're representing should be in the range you're representing. If your opponent is very good at range analysis, they should be able to say, yeah, you have fours here. Definitively. And that's okay, because you also have all sorts of other hands here. When you do check here, though, on the turn, I definitely think you need to have lots of made hands that can continue calling. Maybe Smith thought this was not quite good enough to continue calling. So I don't know. It's a weird spot. And Muggy, yeah, if he is going to bet the turn, like very often, checking and betting small are very, very similar plays, especially when you're out of position, as Smith is here. You have to realize, what's the difference between checking and betting one big blind? Well, checking is betting 0. Betting one big blind is betting 1. Betting 2 big blinds is betting 2, right? Try to think, it's when you're out of position, it's very important. Checking and betting small are almost always the same thing, except betting small gives you some fold equity, and it slightly increases the size of the pot. When you're in position, though, it's very different, because betting then opens a door for you to get raised. So, in position, very often, you should be more inclined to check behind if your hand is very marginal. Whereas out of position, it can be right to continue betting because you get a little bit of fold equity and you also get additional protection. Danny says, don't you want to keep betting flush draws and straight draws? Yes, but you also want to keep betting your sets and your nuts. You don't want to keep betting your marginal made hands. We're trying to get value, right? If you bet with these fours, what you're saying is, I think this hand is good enough to bet the turn for value and still get called by many worse hands. The problem is Negranu's never folding an 8. He's never folding a 5. He's never folding an overpair. And that's a large chunk of his range at this point. Do we think Smith would bet small with his 5x as well? Yeah, almost certainly. Assuming he's trying to be balanced and good. I just think he probably has too many bluffs here to justify, quote-unquote, bluffing these fours. I don't think he's bluffing. I think he's just making a small protection bet. And Negranu decided to stick it to him. And he won the pot. Sometimes they just stick it to you and they steal the pot from you. All right. Here we have Negranu raising 16K in the cutoff with pocket fives. Marchese 3 bets to 50K with ace-2 on the button. Ace-2 suited on the button, sure. Smith 4 bets all in with jacks for 270K, and he gets folds. That seems nice and standard. Let's see. Hello, Jose. Armando. I don't know how to say your last name. Penarial? Penarial. We'll do that. Welcome. It's always good to have people here for the first time. I'm glad you're here. All right, next hand. Smith raises to 17K. Ace-6 offsuit on the button. Negranu calls King-7 offsuit in big blind, perfectly fine. Ace-Queen-8, all 2 diamonds. Smith bets 18K into 44K. Negranu folds. Ugh, this is a close one for Negranu. I know it may not look like a close one. This is one of these spots where if you look at your equity realization, King-7's equity realization is going to be in the dumpster. Like right here, even if he has something like 40% equity or 35% equity, if they were to just get it all in and have no more betting, he's going to end up having to fold the turn of the river a lot of the time. So I think this is a spot where he does just need to fold. I also think Smith may want to bet a little bit bigger on this flop. And that's because he can get called by a lot of worse stuff here. There's a lot of hands he doesn't mind getting called by, and he would like to protect against those for the maximum, I think. All right. Smith raises 16K, and the cutoff with 6-4 suited. This is a little bit loose, but probably fine. Actually, you know what? It may not be fine, because I know Kerry Katz is at this table, and I believe he had almost no chips at this point. I know we haven't really heard from him. Actually, I see him down here a few hands later with 86K. So presumably Kerry's here. When Smith is opening in the cutoff four-handed, it implies he's raising into Kerry. The only way you can justify raising 6-4 with a 10 big blind or 11 big blind stack at the table is if that player is very, very tight. And carry's reasonable, right? I mean, I would say he's probably on the tighter side with a short stack, but he is reasonable enough. So I don't think I'd be opening that. Negreanu 3-bets with ace-jack offsuit. He makes it big, notice, and he gets the fold. And I think that's good. From out of position in the small blind, you're going to find very often that 3-betting is going to be better than calling with most of your offsuit hands. And that's because those hands end up having to check fold on a lot of boards after the flop. So they're often just best check raised on the flop. I'm sorry, not check raised. They're often best 3-bet pre-flop so that you can have the initiative after the flop and be able to apply aggression to your opponent. Making your range polarized immediately is often a very good strategy. Okay, next hand. Let's see. Muggy says, don't we think he should check back the ace-6 on ace-queen 8? Absolutely not. I think it's reasonable, but this board is incredibly draw-heavy. And on incredibly draw-heavy boards, where you also have the range advantage, like he does here, you want to be betting. It would be different if the board was, say, 6-5-4, 2 diamonds. That's the spot where maybe you could justify checking back. But here, I do understand there aren't a lot of horrible turns, but if your opponent bets the turn and your opponent continues... I'm sorry, if your opponent bets the turn, you call, and then they blast the river, you're often in a very bad spot. Usually you're just going to be best off betting now and getting called by a lot of the marginal stuff, like an 8 or a queen. Do these concepts apply in 1-2 cash games? All of these concepts apply because they are teaching you to play very solid game theory optimal poker. You have to figure out, this is your goal when you're playing any poker game, 1-2, 500, 1,000, whatever. What do my opponents do that is drastically incorrect that I can adjust to take advantage of? For almost all of these players, the answer is nothing. You can't make any drastic adjustments to take advantage of them because they're all good. At 1-2, though, a lot of your opponents are going to have really huge holes in their game. We discussed this a little bit earlier, so I'm not going to rehash it again. But if your opponents have giant holes, like they always call continuation bets on the flop, for example, just stop bluffing them, right? It's a really, really easy game when you know what your opponents are going to do wrong. That said, you have to be right about it. Also, we're playing shallow stacked, too. It's shallower than a 1-2 cash game. All right, here, Marchese raises cutoff, king 9 offsuit. This is almost always fine, but you could certainly justify folding it if you think you're going to get jammed a lot. Smith calls the button with king queen suited. Remember I just was discussing, often you're better off 3-betting the offsuit hands, calling the suited hands. Well, king queen, even offsuit, is very often a fine calling hand, but you should almost always be calling with the suited variety of it. And he does call with the suited variety. Flop comes 10, 8, 2. Let's see. Marchese checks, king 9. Smith elects to bet. And this is a tough one. I think it's interesting that Smith bet, first off. I think the bet's fine. Whenever your opponent does check, you definitely want to ask, what hands in my range are not good enough to check down? And also, which hands are good to bluff because they have some equity on various turns? And king queen definitely does fit in that category. Now, I completely understand that in this spot, the king queen doesn't have backdoor flush draws. Usually you'd love to have backdoor flush draw here, but he doesn't have that. However, given there are 2 diamonds on the flop, he can often just keep bluffing on diamonds. If he gets raised, he can very easily fold. So I actually think this is fine. And then back to Marchese, it kind of sucks, right? He does have backdoor gut shot. He has an overcard. But I think he has to fold. One thing to learn from this hand, if you all are observing, when people check to you on the flop, you should often be betting. I think most people, when they're checking the flop, it's either going to be garbage or marginal made hands. And they're going to fold all their garbage immediately. And against the marginal made hands, you often have some amount of equity. Like right here, imagine Marchese was checking pocket 7s or 9-8. Well, even then, Smith still has a decent amount of equity to improve to beat him. And if a diamond comes on the turn, he can often bluff him. And a jack. If a jack comes on the turn, he can often bluff him. So, pretty sweet spot. Pat's Poker, welcome. All right. So I guess the other question is, should Marchese just continuation bet the flop? This is a flop that should be quite good for the pre-flop caller, given it's two middle connected cards. And because it's two middle connected cards, if you continuation bet too often, your opponent can very easily crush you just by raising a decent chunk of the time. And remember I said Smith is a really good aggressive player. This is the type of player you do not want to continuation bet too often against because he's going to punish you. All right, next hand. Caps raises all in with pocket jacks from the cutoff. Marchese calls with ace-10 offsuit. That's a close one. So it's interesting. Katz is known to be a little bit on the tighter side with the shallow stack. At least from my experience, I got to commentate on him playing the 100K that he won in the PCA, and he definitely played on the tighter side. So this is a situation where I don't think you should fold the ace-10 in any normal spot, but I think it's fine to fold it. If Carey's been overly tight, see the thing is against someone like Carey, if he's been overly tight, he's liable to just jam 8-5 suited on the next hand because he realizes he's been overly tight, and he'll take advantage of that image. So I think you just have to call it off here. So Marchese calls. One thing a lot of people don't quite understand, when someone jams for something like 6 big blinds or more, notice here, Carey's shoving more than 6 big blinds, Marchese should call with his whole range if he wants to have some hands in his range that can fold if Smith goes all in the big blind. So if you want to be calling with stuff like ace-10 here, you should definitely fold it if you get shoved on. You do not want to shove ace-10 yourself because then you open the door for Smith to make easy calls with ace-queen and ace-king and aces, kings, queens, and jacks, where he really dominated, right? But by calling, you get to fold out the bottom portion of your range. And Marchese would also definitely call with all of his good hands too. He's going to almost certainly call with his whole range in this scenario, understanding that he's going to fold the bottom of it when he gets jammed. So very good call by the ace-10. Smith shoves the ace-queen, which I think is good. You do have to be a little bit careful because sometimes Marchese will be trapping you, but it is what it is. Jose says, and trapping with aces and kings. Yeah, he's trapping with, he's calling with aces, kings, queens, jacks, and ace-king, and he's going to call the shove. He's also calling with ace-queen, which may or may not call the shove, ace-jack, ace-10, and then maybe stuff like 9s, 8s, 7s, 9s, 8s, and 7s. So that's probably what he's doing in this spot, and then looking to fold out the lower portion of that range if Smith shoves. Smith does shove with ace-queen, and move on to the next hand. Katz apparently got the triple up. Is that the real Ghost of M? It is the real Ghost of M. The Ghost of M has been with me for... he may have been in my first poker stream before streaming poker was legal on Twitch. A lot of you may not know this. I was one of the first poker streamers on Twitch about 7 years ago. And I streamed 4 or 5 times, and they banned me because you were not allowed to stream poker on Twitch. But here we are later, and now Ghost of M's been with me since I started streaming again, 4 years ago or so, however long it's been. Welcome back. Welcome back. Hello, Hyper Viper. That is a very aggressive name. All right. Next hand, we have Marchese opening to 17K with Queen 6 suited on the button. Smith calls small blind ace-7 offsuit. Oh, man. See, this is something I virtually never do, but maybe it's good. I do know, like I mentioned, playing around with Munker Solver, that it does suggest calling more often in this spot as opposed to 3-betting, but I would just like literally never call here. I'm 3-betting it or I'm folding it. Everyone going nuts in the chat saying that this call is ridiculous. One thing that you must understand, it's very important, is that you are not the authority here. I am not the authority here. The people at this final table who I respect their games are the authorities here. If you see them do something that makes literally no sense to you, it often means that you don't understand something properly. And in this spot, I can probably tell you the reason he called, and it's probably because he thinks Marchese's opening a lot, but he also thinks that if he 3-bets, he's going to get jammed on a lot. So, if you're going to get jammed on a lot, that's not good when you have ace-7 offsuit. So, that's a reason not to 3-bet. If you think Marchese's opening too wide pre-flop, that's also not a reason to 3-bet, because you can call and realize your equity a little bit better because you're going to start with more equity. Also, we have carry cats in the big blind. Maybe he wants to keep carry cats in the pot because he knows he's going to defend very wide in this spot. So instead of just saying stuff like, never call the small blind, instead think, why is this very top tier player calling in this spot? And I've just outlined a few very clear reasons. So yeah, there it is. Let's see. Flop comes. Queen, 10, 6. All diamonds. That gives carry cats a flush. And that gives Marchese 2 pair. Oh boy. All right. So checks to Marchese, who bets 20K into 58K. Carry cats just calls. I would definitely raise here if I was in Carry's shoes. Carry Cats' goal needs to be to get all the money in before the board runs out any worse. He also has to worry that if Marchese does have a hand like King Queen, the turn maybe a diamond that's going to make Marchese not pay him. So I think you just want to raise here immediately, and you may even want to go all in. I know that may sound a little bit absurd and a little bit huge, but in this scenario, carry cats could very easily have the ace high of diamonds, right? So that's a very obvious bluffing hand that you would not mind jamming and getting folds. He could also have some flushes, and the flushes are often going to be lower flushes that don't mind protection. So I think this is a spot where I really wish Marchese would have bet bigger on the flop. Like if he bet 30, I would be all in for sure for the 260. But when he does bet 20, maybe you're supposed to make it like 70 and then jam the river or jam the turn. But yeah, he decides to call. I really don't like calling just because it allows hands to get off the hook that would have to pay you immediately. And when Marchese bets into 2 people on this board, you have to assume Marchese is going to have at least something, either some sort of made hand or some sort of draw. All right, turns an 8. Marchese, he checks again. Marchese bets 56K. And now he decides to go all in, and Marchese folds. Wow. Very, very good, disciplined fold by Marchese. I already mentioned that I thought carry cats was a bit on the tighter side when it came to playing the shallower stacks. So what is a tight range to go all in this spot? I don't even know. It's going to be flushes. Notice that the 8 allows Jack 9 to get there. Would carry cats ever jam something like Queen Jack with a Jack of diamonds? I don't know. Would he jam that ace high diamond on the turn? I don't know. One thing I've also been noting when I've been observing these best players in the world play is that they do not pay off very often when they're against someone who they think has a tight range and they have a very strong hand, but still a non-nut hand. Like in this scenario, I could just see myself making the call. Like, I mean, the guy could have lots of ace of diamonds, so I guess I have to call. But they don't have to have a lot of ace of diamonds. Maybe they just don't have that in their range. So very, very good fold. Not just a good fold because it was right. Good fold because it takes incredible discipline, and it makes a lot of sense given, I think, Cass's range there is going to be tighter than most people's. That's an example of a good exploitative fold. If you're folding in that spot every time to everyone, you're probably folding a hair too much. All right, let's see. Chris says, what's this say? I think you're trying to ask, what are the reasons to get Munker Solver if you have Poker Snowy? Poker Snowy is not a solver. A solver is a program that uses a ton of resources, and it's not like a program like Poker Snowy. It's almost like playing against a bot, or a program that runs your hand histories through an algorithm and tries to find spots where you're doing something wrong. That is not what a solver is. That is just a analytical program. Solvers go through and they run tons and tons of simulations, and they figure out what the optimal play is in a spot. and they take a lot of resources. They're way more difficult to use than Poker Snowy because Poker Snowy is like an easy program. I would definitely suggest that you look up videos of people using these programs on YouTube or whatever. I think that's going to be your best strategy or best way to approach this. I mean, what I do is I don't have any of the solvers on my computer, but I outsource them. I outsource the things I want to look up to people who are really good at these programs, and I just pay them, right? Because I realize that they have all this information and knowledge and know how to use these things, and they have supercomputers that they run them on, whereas I just have my little laptop sitting right over there. So be smart about it. Realize that you're not going to have your computer up and running a simulation for a month. Munker solver simulations, by the way, take notoriously long to run. Like, just common spots will take a month, and you don't want to have your computer sitting there running a calculation for a month. What a lot of people do, like the Poker backing company I'm part of, they rent virtual servers, and then they run the programs on those virtual supercomputers. Anyway, I don't have a supercomputer, so I don't fiddle with that. But I get all the knowledge from them. Okay, here we have another hand, 4,000 to 8,000. Cats limp small blind with ace-8 suited. That seems great. Negreanu raises Jack-7 offsuit. I would probably say that Jack-7 offsuit is a hand that you should check, just because it's going to realize its equity quite well in position, whereas if you raise, now you've gotten rid of Katz's garbage hands, and now his range is going to be mostly reasonable, right? So if his range is mostly reasonable, then now Jack-7 doesn't do so well. Whereas if his range is any two cards, or very close to any two cards, or maybe any two cards minus the top portion, Jack-7 does pretty well in position. I'm typically raising way more polarized in this spot than apparently Negreanu is. I'm just raising my best hands and then some absolute garbage. All right, Cats calls. Cats could have re-raised, but I definitely like calling with these stacks. If Negreanu somehow made it like 40k, I'd be more inclined to shove, but even then shoving's quite big. I don't think you want to be risking that in a tournament. So I would just call. Flop comes king, 9, 5, 2 diamonds. It goes check, check. I'm a little surprised it goes check, check here. I think Negreanu should probably bet small. But I definitely get why he doesn't. Whenever it comes king, 9, 5 or queen, 8, 4, these are boards where if your opponent's playing reasonable hands, they're often going to have some sort of a pair or a gut shot. And if they have a pair or a gut shot, then they're not folding, right? And the problem with that type of range of pair or gut shot is that you can make the gut shots fold with an additional bet, but you're not going to make the pairs fold. So if you're not going to make the pairs fold, it becomes a pretty dicey spot to just bluff off your stack, no problem. So it does go check, check. Turns a queen. I'm, again, kind of surprised that Negreanu did not bluff here. I definitely get that Cass is just checking down and praying he can win. But I think Negreanu should probably bluff the turn. It's kind of same story on the flop, though, that it's so easy for Cats to have some piece of this board. So if Negreanu does bet the turn, he definitely needs to bet the river as well. All right, river's a 2 of diamonds. Cats checks. Negreanu decides to bet. This is a great spot to bet if you're against someone who you know is always going to bet a pair by the river. So if this is a hand that is, I'm sorry, if you know your opponent has a pair when they bet, that means when they don't bet, they don't have a pair. And if you can get someone to fold ace high on the river, which should be a lot of Cats' limping and then calling range, right? Then this is a fine spot to bluff. That said, if Cats realizes, well, I'm not saying this is a case for Cats, but if Cats' range on the river is all ace high and worse, or mostly ace high and worse, well, now he has to call with some ace highs, right? So I'm not exactly sure what people's ranges look like in this scenario, but I could very easily see this bluff not being good if Cats understands that ace high is the top of his range when it goes check, 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 check. That says pre-flop. Maybe this is the bottom checking back range changed to bluff. Well, think about what you just said. What is the bottom of your checking back range? That should be your nut low hands, right? Like 3-2. So this is certainly not worse than 3-2, the Jack-7, I mean. Maybe you're saying this is a hand that is on the cusp of raising, but it's not. You're definitely not raising Jack-8 for value. Okay, so now you say, never mind, you do not understand the position. Okay, that's fine.